Her movements were economical and controlled, lacking any of the frantic energy that victims typically displayed when their clothing was damaged during an assault. The exposed skin had revealed not just unexpected musculature, but a series of small, precise scars that spoke to years of contact training that had nothing to do with academic pursuits. "You boys need to leave my classroom immediately," Sarah said, her voice carrying a new quality that made all three students shift uncomfortably. The gentle tone they'd associated with her teaching persona had been replaced by something harder, more commanding, though she hadn't raised her volume above normal conversation level. Marcus recovered first from his momentary confusion, his entitled upbringing reasserting itself as he processed what he interpreted as a teacher's attempt to regain authority through stern language. In his experience, faculty members who tried to sound tough were simply revealing their underlying weakness, and physical intimidation remained the most effective tool for breaking down their resistance. "Or what?" Marcus challenged, stepping closer to Sarah's position behind the desk. "You'll report us to Principal Davidson? Good luck with that. My dad's construction company just won the bid for the new gymnasium renovation, and Coach Henderson has already told everyone that any discipline action against varsity players during championship season would be career suicide for whoever initiated it." Danny moved to flank Sarah's position, his confidence returning as Marcus reasserted their group's dominance. "Plus, who's going to believe that 3 honor students and team captains came to threaten a teacher? Especially when it's your word against ours, and you don't exactly have any evidence of what just happened here." Kyle's contribution was a low laugh that rumbled through his massive frame as he shifted position to block the door more completely. "Yeah, and even if someone did believe you, what are they going to do? Suspend us right before the state championship? Cancel the biggest game of the season because a teacher can't handle some friendly conversation?" Sarah listened to their reasoning with the kind of focused attention she'd once applied to studying opponents before major competitions. These young men had clearly perfected their intimidation techniques through repeated success, and their confidence was built on a foundation of genuine immunity from consequences. They understood the power structures at Riverside High better than most faculty members, and they'd learned to exploit those systems with ruthless efficiency. "You're absolutely right about the reporting process," Sarah said, surprising them with her agreement. "The administration would find ways to minimize any complaints I filed, and your athletic value would protect you from meaningful consequences. Your family's influence would ensure that any investigation was brief and inconclusive." Marcus's smile returned as he interpreted her words as acceptance of their superior position. "Exactly, so why don't we just forget this whole conversation happened and focus on finding some ways for you to show better school spirit? I'm sure we can work out arrangements that benefit everyone involved." "However," Sarah continued, her tone remaining conversational, "you've made several critical errors in your assessment of this situation. First, you assumed that I would respond to intimidation the same way other teachers have. Second, you assumed that my professional demeanor reflected personal weakness rather than strategic choice. And third, you assumed that I was helpless in this situation." Danny's expression shifted to irritation as Sarah's words suggested continued resistance rather than the submission they'd expected to achieve by now. "Listen, lady, you're not in a position to make demands or threats. There are 3 of us, and one of you were bigger and stronger, and nobody's coming to help you. Maybe you should focus on reality instead of whatever fantasy you're living in." Sarah's response was to move around her desk with fluid precision that immediately altered the classroom's tactical dynamics. Instead of remaining trapped behind the furniture barrier, she positioned herself in the open space near the whiteboard, where she had full range of movement and clear sight lines to all 3 students. Her positioning was so natural that it appeared casual, but her new location provided tactical advantages that none of the football players immediately recognized. "Reality," Sarah said quietly, is often different from appearance. For instance, you see a small woman who teaches literature and assume that makes me helpless. You see someone who speaks softly and conclude that means I can't or won't fight back. You see a teacher's professional behavior and interpret it as personal weakness. Kyle stepped away from the door, his massive frame moving with surprising speed as he decided that direct physical intimidation was necessary to end Sarah's unexpected resistance. His approach was designed to use his size advantage to overwhelm her through proximity and implied violence, a technique that had proven effective in every previous encounter. "Enough talking," Kyle rumbled as he closed the distance between them. "You can do this the easy way or the hard way, but either way, you're going to understand how things work around here." Sarah watched his approach with the kind of analytical focus she'd once applied to studying competition footage, noting his gait, balance, and the slight favoring of his left side that suggested an old injury from football training. Kyle moved, like someone who'd learned to use his size to intimidate, but who'd never faced serious resistance from a trained opponent. His confidence was built on overwhelming smaller, weaker targets who lacked the knowledge or ability to counter his physical advantages. When Kyle reached what he considered optimal intimidation distance, roughly 2 feet from Sarah's position, he stopped and loomed over her with the expectation that his presence alone would trigger the fear response that had proven so effective with other faculty members. His 6'4" frame and 250-pound bulk created an imposing shadow, and his reputation for violence added psychological weight to his physical presence. "Last chance," Kyle said, his voice dropping to what he imagined was a menacing whisper. "Apologize for being difficult. Agree to give us the special consideration we deserve, and maybe we'll forget about how disrespectful you've been." Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying Kyle's positioning with the kind of professional interest that a chess master might show when analyzing an opponent's tactical error. Her movement was minimal, but something in her expression made Kyle suddenly uncertain about the dynamics he thought he understood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Picture this. You're a soft-spoken high school teacher, quietly grading papers during lunch break when 3 senior football players decide to corner you in an empty classroom. They think you're an easy target because you never raise your voice, never send students to detention, and always wear conservative cardigans that hide your arms. What these arrogant teenagers don't know is that Miss Sarah Chen isn't just any teacher. She's a 3rd-degree black belt who spent 8 years competing in international karate championships before a career-ending injury forced her into education. What happened next became the most talked-about incident in Riverside High School's 40-year history, and the moment these bullies realized that the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous one. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Riverside High School as Sarah Chen organized her lesson plans in classroom 237, her sanctuary on the building's quietest floor. At 28, she had the kind of understated presence that made students initially underestimate her intelligence and dedication. Sarah preferred it that way. After 3 years at Riverside, she'd perfected the art of being professionally invisible, competent enough to avoid administrative scrutiny, but unremarkable enough to escape the drama that seemed to follow more outspoken faculty members. Sarah had learned early in her teaching career that survival in public education required strategic adaptation. Fresh out of her master's program in literature, she'd arrived at Riverside with idealistic plans to inspire students and transform lives. Through the power of great writing, reality had been far more complicated. Riverside High served a diverse community where academic achievement often took a backseat to social hierarchies, athletic success, and the complex politics of teenage social survival. The school building itself reflected these competing priorities. While the athletic facilities gleamed with modern equipment funded by boosters and championship victories, the academic wings showed their age through peeling paint, outdated textbooks, and classroom furniture that had seen better decades. Sarah's classroom occupied a corner of the English wing where foot traffic was minimal and administrative oversight was practically non-existent. She'd requested the location specifically for its isolation, understanding that sometimes the best teaching happened away from the spotlight. Sarah's teaching philosophy had evolved through necessity and hard-won experience. She discovered that quiet consistency accomplished more than dramatic gestures, that listening achieved better results than lecturing, and that respect had to be earned through patience rather than demanded through authority. Her students initially tested her gentle approach, expecting the kind of explosive reactions they'd learned to provoke from other teachers. Instead, they encountered someone who responded to disruption with calm redirection, to challenges with quiet firmness, and to genuine need with unwavering support. What her students and colleagues didn't know was that Sarah's composed demeanor had been forged through years of intense physical and mental discipline that had nothing to do with education. Before entering the classroom, Sarah Chen had been one of the most promising competitive martial artists in the country, with tournament victories spanning 3 different weight classes and techniques that had earned her recognition from masters who rarely praised anyone under 30. The transition from competitor to teacher had been born from necessity rather than choice. A devastating knee injury during the national championships had ended her competitive career just as she was being considered for the Olympic development team. The months of surgery, rehabilitation, and accepting that her body would never again perform at elite levels had forced Sarah to reimagine her entire future. Teaching had seemed like a natural extension of her desire to guide and develop others, even if the arena was intellectual rather than physical. Sarah maintained her martial arts training with the same discipline she brought to lesson planning, rising each morning at 5 to practice forms and meditation before preparing for her school day. The physical conditioning that had once prepared her for international competition now served as stress relief and mental preparation for managing teenage behavior and administrative demands. Her small apartment's spare bedroom had been converted into a training space where she could maintain the muscle memory and reflexes that years of competition had ingrained into her very being. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that her greatest strength was also her most carefully guarded secret. In a profession where authority often depended on perception and presence, she'd chosen to project gentleness rather than power, understanding that intimidation created compliance rather than genuine learning. Her students responded to her calm presence and genuine interest in their development, but they had no idea that their soft-spoken English teacher could disable an attacker in seconds, or that her gentle hands had once been registered weapons in 3 different martial arts federations. As Sarah finished organizing tomorrow's lesson on character development in classic literature, she reflected on the parallels between her classroom and her former competitive arena. Both required reading opponents, understanding their strengths and weaknesses, and responding with precisely the right technique at exactly the right moment. The difference was that in teaching, victory meant student growth rather than physical dominance, and the most satisfying wins were the ones where her students didn't even realize they'd been guided toward success. The late afternoon quiet was interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway outside her classroom. Sarah glanced at the clock, noting that most faculty had departed for the day, and the building should have been nearly empty except for custodial staff and a few students serving detention. The footsteps seemed to pause outside her door, and Sarah felt the familiar heightened awareness that years of competitive training had developed whenever potential threats approached. She continued grading papers while listening to the movement in the hallway, her trained senses automatically cataloging the number of people, their approximate sizes based on footfall patterns, and their apparent intention to linger near her classroom rather than simply passing through. Sarah's classroom door was closed but not locked, standard practice for teachers working after hours, but one that suddenly felt like poor tactical planning. The footsteps resolved into voices, and Sarah recognized the distinctive laughter of Marcus Webb, Riverside High's star quarterback, whose combination of athletic talent and family wealth had made him virtually untouchable within the school's social ecosystem. Marcus came from old money that had built half the commercial district downtown, and his father's construction company employed parents of numerous students and faculty members. The Webb family's influence extended far beyond athletics into school. Board politics, municipal contracts, and the kind of community connections that made challenging their son's behavior professionally hazardous for most teachers. Sarah had encountered Marcus in her sophomore literature class the previous semester, where he demonstrated the particular brand of entitled disrespect that came from never experiencing meaningful consequences for his actions. He'd arrived late consistently, disrupted discussions with deliberate irrelevance, and submitted work that was clearly completed by someone else. When Sarah had attempted to address these issues through standard academic channels, she'd discovered that Marcus's previous teachers had learned to accommodate rather than confront, understanding that administrative support for disciplinary action against star athletes was virtually non-existent. The voices in the hallway were joined by two others that Sarah recognized with growing unease. Danny Rodriguez was Marcus's closest friend and the team's defensive captain, whose family owned the largest auto dealership in 3 counties. Danny possessed the kind of aggressive personality that coaches loved on the field, but that made him dangerous in unstructured social situations. He'd been suspended twice for fighting, but each incident had resulted in reduced consequences after intensive lobbying from parents, coaches, and community boosters who viewed his aggression as evidence of competitive spirit rather than problematic behavior. The third voice belonged to Kyle Morrison, whose massive frame and reputation for violence had earned him college recruitment offers, despite mediocre grades and a disciplinary record that would have resulted in expulsion for any student without his athletic value. Kyle's father had died in military service, and his mother worked double shifts at the hospital to support the family, leaving Kyle largely unsupervised and answerable primarily to coaches who prioritize his performance over his character development. His combination of size, anger, and lack of supervision had created someone genuinely dangerous when his temper was provoked. Together, these 3 formed the nucleus of Riverside High's untouchable elite, protected by their athletic value, family connections, and the administration's unwillingness to risk the community backlash that would follow any serious disciplinary action against star players. Kyle Morrison, Sarah said, her voice carrying a new quality that made all 3 students freeze. Defensive tackle, jersey number 57, verbal commitment to State University contingent on maintaining eligibility through graduation. 2. Previous suspensions for fighting, both reduced to in-school detention after intervention from boosters and coaching staff. Kyle's confidence faltered as Sarah demonstrated knowledge of his record that went beyond what any teacher should know about students outside their classes. How do you know about my suspensions? That information is supposed to be confidential. I know because I make it my business to understand potential threats, Sarah replied, her tone remaining conversational while her meaning became increasingly clear. I know that your anger management issues stem from frustration about your father's death and your mother's financial struggles. I know that your aggressive behavior is tolerated because coaches view it as competitive fire rather than addressing the underlying psychological problems that drive it. Marcus and Danny exchanged glances that reflected growing unease about the direction this confrontation was taking. Sarah's detailed knowledge of Kyle's personal history suggested access to information that ordinary teachers shouldn't possess, and her calm demeanor was becoming more unsettling than reassuring. I also know, Sarah continued, that your full ride. Scholarship offer is contingent on avoiding any further disciplinary incidents, which means that what you're contemplating right now could cost you your entire future. Kyle's face flushed with anger at having his vulnerabilities exposed so clinically, and his response was to close the remaining distance between himself and Sarah with clear intent to use physical force to end the conversation. His movement was fast for someone his size, but it carried the predictable pattern of someone accustomed to overwhelming opponents through strength rather than technique. Sarah's reaction was so swift and precise that the other two students initially couldn't process what they'd witnessed. As Kyle's massive hand reached toward her shoulder, Sarah moved with the kind of explosive speed that only came from years of competitive training. Her response wasn't the panicked flailing that Kyle expected from cornered teachers, but the calculated technique of someone who'd spent thousands of hours perfecting her craft. The result was Kyle Morrison, star defensive tackle and the most feared student in Riverside High's recent history, suddenly finding himself face down on the classroom floor with his arm twisted behind his back in a joint lock that caused immediate and excruciating pain whenever he tried to move. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds and had been executed with surgical precision that left no doubt about Sarah's training and capabilities. The technique you just experienced, Sarah said calmly, maintaining the joint lock while Kyle gasped in pain and shock, is called an arm drag into a hammerlock. It's designed to control aggressive opponents without causing permanent damage, though continued resistance will result in dislocation of your shoulder joint. Marcus and Danny stared in stunned silence as their supposedly helpless victim maintained effortless control over the largest and most intimidating member of their group. The casual competence Sarah displayed while restraining Kyle suggested expertise that went far beyond basic self-defense training. Now then, Sarah continued, her voice maintaining its characteristic gentleness despite the dramatic shift in power dynamics. I believe we were discussing the importance of understanding reality versus appearance. The silence in classroom 237 was broken only by Kyle's labored breathing as he remained motionless on the floor, his predicament serving as a stark demonstration of how completely the power dynamics had shifted in less than 10 seconds. Marcus and Danny stood frozen in positions that had been strategically advantageous moments earlier, but now left them isolated and exposed, their carefully planned intimidation session having devolved into something neither had imagined possible. Sarah maintained her hold on Kyle with the kind of effortless control that spoke to muscle memory developed through years of high-level competition. Her breathing remained steady, her posture relaxed, and her expression carried the focused calm of someone completely comfortable with physical confrontation. The transformation from gentle literature teacher to skilled martial artist was so complete that the 3 students struggled to reconcile what they were witnessing with their previous assumptions about her capabilities. The interesting thing about leverage, Sarah said conversationally, adjusting her grip slightly to demonstrate how minimal pressure could produce maximum results, is that it allows smaller forces to control much larger ones when applied with proper technique and understanding of anatomy. Kyle is discovering that his size advantage means nothing when his joints are positioned correctly. Kyle attempted to push himself up from the floor, but the joint lock immediately translated his movement into sharp pain that radiated through his shoulder and down his arm. His frustrated grunt carried the shock of someone experiencing physical helplessness for the first time in his adult life, and his inability to break free despite his significant strength advantage was clearly devastating to his self-image. Stop moving, Sarah advised quietly. The more you struggle, the more likely you are to cause actual damage to your rotator cuff, which would end your football career before you graduate. I'd recommend staying perfectly still while we finish our conversation. Marcus found his voice first, though it carried none of the confident intimidation that had characterized his earlier statements. Let him go. You're assaulting a student, and when we report this, you'll be fired and arrested. Nobody's going to believe that. Teacher attacked 3 students without provocation. Sarah's laugh was genuinely amused, a sound that somehow made the situation even more unsettling for the 2 students still standing. Marcus, you're operating under several false assumptions. First, you assume that what just happened constitutes assault rather than lawful self-defense against an aggressive individual who is attempting to physically intimidate me. Second, you assume that your word carries more weight than video evidence. Danny's eyes widened as he processed the implications of her statement. What video evidence? Nobody's recording anything. Actually, Sarah replied, maintaining her hold on Kyle while nodding toward a discreet camera mounted near the ceiling. Riverside High installed security cameras in all classrooms. 2 years ago, following the incident with Mr. Thompson and that parent who became violent during a conference. The administration doesn't advertise their presence because they prefer students and faculty to behave naturally. But every classroom interaction is recorded and stored on secure servers. The blood drained from Marcus's face as he realized that their entire intimidation session, including his destruction of Sarah's clothing and Kyle's aggressive approach, had been captured in high-definition detail. The evidence would clearly show 3 large male students cornering a female teacher in an isolated classroom, escalating to physical contact and being subdued only when one of them attempted what would clearly appear to be assault. Moreover, Sarah continued, her voice maintaining its educational tone as if she were explaining a particularly complex literary concept, I should mention that my background includes more than just competitive martial arts. Before transitioning to education, I spent 2 years working with the district attorney's office as a victim advocate specializing in cases involving intimidation and assault. I'm quite familiar with the legal definitions and evidentiary requirements. For various charges, Kyle made another attempt to escape the joint lock, and Sarah responded by applying precisely enough additional pressure to demonstrate her control without causing permanent damage. His sharp intake of breath served as punctuation to her legal analysis, and his continued helplessness was clearly affecting the confidence of his 2 companions. The charges you're currently facing, Sarah explained with the clinical precision of someone who'd testified in numerous court proceedings, include criminal intimidation, destruction of property, conspiracy to commit assault, and depending on how the prosecutor interprets Kyle's actions, possibly attempted sexual assault. Given the deliberate nature of the clothing damage, Danny's voice cracked slightly as the full scope of their legal exposure became clear. You can't prove we planned any of this. We just came to talk to you about academic standards, and things got out of hand. Actually, the video evidence will show clear coordination in your positioning, deliberate blocking of exit routes, and escalating verbal threats that establish intent to intimidate. More importantly, you're not the first students to attempt this particular approach with Riverside faculty, and I've been documenting the pattern for several months. Sarah reached into her desk drawer with her free hand and withdrew a thick file folder that she placed on the desk where both remaining students could see it. The folder was labeled with their names and contained what appeared to be extensive documentation, photographs, and witness statements. Mrs. Patterson in chemistry was kind enough to provide detailed statements about her encounters with your group last semester. Mr. Rodriguez, in social studies, documented the pressure campaign you used to modify his grading policies. Even Coach Henderson, who's protected you from consequences in the past, provided information about your threats to transfer to rival schools if academic standards weren't adjusted to accommodate your preferences. Marcus stared at the file folder with growing horror as he realized that their successful intimidation campaigns against other teachers had been systematically documented by someone who understood how to build legal cases. That's impossible. None of those teachers would talk to you about confidential interactions with students. They would and did when approached by someone with proper credentials and legal authority, Sarah replied. You see, I've maintained my certification as a victim advocate, and the district attorney's office asked me to investigate reports of systematic intimidation at Riverside High. Your group's activities have been under official scrutiny for the past 3 months. The revelation that Sarah was operating in an official capacity as part of a law enforcement investigation rather than simply defending herself as an isolated teacher transformed the entire situation. Kyle's position on the classroom floor was no longer that of a student subdued by an educator, but of a suspect restrained during the commission of documented crimes. "This is entrapment," Danny protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "You let us come in here and say all that stuff just so you could record it and use it against us. Entrapment requires law enforcement to induce criminal behavior that wouldn't have occurred otherwise," Sarah corrected with the patience of someone who'd explained legal concepts to confused defendants numerous times. "You 3 chose to enter my classroom. You chose to make threats. You chose to destroy my property, and Kyle chose to attempt physical assault. I simply documented your voluntary actions." Sarah's phone, which had been discreetly recording audio throughout the encounter, chimed with an incoming message. She glanced at the screen while maintaining her control over Kyle, then looked up at Marcus and Danny with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with genuine concern for their futures. "That message is from Detective Morrison at the county sheriff's office. He's Kyle's uncle, actually, and he's been coordinating with the district attorney's investigation into intimidation patterns at local high schools. He's requesting permission to review the classroom footage and my documentation file." Kyle's sharp intake of breath at the mention of his uncle suggested a family relationship that would make this situation particularly devastating. Detective Morrison's reputation for integrity meant that Kyle couldn't expect family protection from the legal consequences of his actions, and his uncle's involvement would likely result in more severe rather than reduced charges. "Please," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a whisper as the full scope of their situation became clear. "We didn't mean for things to go this far. We were just trying to get you to be more flexible about grades and attendance policies. We never intended to actually hurt anyone." Sarah studied Marcus's face with the analytical attention she'd once applied to evaluating competition opponents, noting the genuine fear that had replaced his earlier arrogance. The transformation from entitled intimidator to frightened teenager was complete, and his desperation was affecting his ability to think strategically about damage control. "The problem with intimidation campaigns," Sarah explained, releasing Kyle's arm and stepping back as he remained motionless on the floor, "is that they depend on victims remaining silent and isolated. Once someone documents the pattern and involves proper authorities, the entire system collapses very quickly." Kyle slowly pushed himself to his knees, his movements careful and deliberate as he tested his shoulder for damage. The joint lock had been applied with surgical precision, causing intense pain without permanent injury, but his expression showed the psychological impact of being effortlessly controlled by someone he'd assumed was physically helpless. "What happens now?" Kyle asked quietly, his voice carrying none of the aggressive menace that had characterized his earlier statements. "Are you going to have us arrested?" Sarah walked to her desk and organized the documentation file with the same methodical attention she applied to lesson planning, though her movements remained fluid and alert. The question of consequences was clearly weighing on all 3 students, and their earlier confidence had been completely replaced by genuine fear about their futures. "That depends entirely on your choices during the next few minutes," Sarah replied, settling into her chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who held complete control over the situation. "You have the opportunity to demonstrate accountability and begin making amends for your behavior, or you can continue the pattern that brought you to this point." Danny moved closer to his companions, the 3 of them unconsciously forming a defensive huddle as they processed their options. The tactical positioning that had seemed so advantageous when they'd entered the classroom now felt exposed and vulnerable, and their awareness of the recording equipment made every word and gesture feel significant. "What kind of accountability are you talking about?" Danny asked, though his tone suggested someone hoping for clemency rather than negotiating from strength. "Full confessions detailing your intimidation campaigns against Riverside faculty, including specific incidents, methods used, and other students who participated. Written apologies to every teacher you've targeted, acknowledging the impact of your behavior on their professional lives and mental health. Cooperation with the district attorney's investigation into systematic bullying at elite high schools throughout the county." Marcus's face showed the internal struggle between his entitled upbringing and the reality of facing adult consequences for his actions. "And if we cooperate fully, what happens to the charges?" "Cooperation doesn't eliminate consequences," Sarah clarified, "but it influences how those consequences are applied. Juvenile detention versus adult court, expulsion versus transfer opportunities, college admission impacts versus complete scholarship loss. The choices you make now determine whether you have opportunities for redemption or simply face maximum penalties." The three students exchanged glances that communicated their understanding that Sarah held complete power over their immediate futures. The investigation she described would proceed regardless of their cooperation, but their level of accountability would significantly influence whether they retained any control over the outcomes. Kyle spoke first, his voice carrying the exhausted tone of someone who'd finally accepted reality. "I'll cooperate. I'll confess to everything and provide any information you need about other incidents or students involved." His capitulation seemed to break the remaining resistance from his companions, and Danny quickly added his agreement to cooperate fully with the investigation. Marcus held out longer, his privileged background making it difficult to accept that his family's influence wouldn't protect him from these particular consequences, but eventually nodded his agreement as well. "Excellent," Sarah said, pulling out a digital recorder and placing it on the desk between them. "We'll start with detailed statements about today's incident, then move through your previous intimidation campaigns chronologically. Detective Morrison will be here within 30 minutes to witness your statements and begin the formal legal process." Over the following hour, the three students provided comprehensive confessions that detailed months of systematic intimidation targeting faculty members they'd perceived as vulnerable. Their statements revealed a sophisticated understanding of Riverside High's power structures and administrative weaknesses, along with coordination with students at other elite schools who shared similar tactics. When Detective Morrison arrived, his disappointment in his nephew's behavior was evident, but his professional commitment to justice took precedence over family relationships. Kyle's emotional breakdown during his formal confession was particularly devastating, as he realized that his actions had destroyed not only his own future, but had also betrayed the sacrifice his father had made in military service. The immediate consequences began within hours of the confessions. Principal Davidson, faced with video evidence and legal pressure, had no choice but to initiate expulsion proceedings for all three students. Their college recruitment offers were withdrawn. As news of the criminal charges reached university athletic departments, the broader investigation expanded to include other schools and additional students, ultimately revealing a network of systematic intimidation that had affected dozens of educators across multiple districts. Sarah's role in the investigation elevated her status within the education community, but more importantly, it created a template for addressing intimidation that could be applied at other institutions. Her methodical approach to documentation, legal preparation, and tactical response became a training model for educators dealing with similar situations. The transformation at Riverside High was immediate and dramatic. Students who had operated through intimidation and privilege found themselves subject to genuine accountability for the first time in their academic careers. Faculty members who had accommodated problematic behavior out of fear discovered that proper documentation and legal support could provide protection against even the most connected families. Sarah's literature classes took on new energy as students recognized that their teacher's gentle demeanor reflected strength rather than weakness. Her lessons about character development and moral courage carried additional weight when delivered by someone who had demonstrated both qualities under pressure. The respect she commanded was earned through competence rather than intimidation, creating a classroom environment where genuine learning could flourish. 6 months later, Sarah stood before the State Education Committee delivering testimony about systematic intimidation in elite academic institutions. Her presentation combined legal analysis, educational theory, and practical experience in ways that influenced policy development throughout the region. The program she developed for training educators to recognize and respond to intimidation became a model implemented in school districts across multiple states. The 3 former students faced different paths forward based on their levels of cooperation and accountability. Kyle, whose cooperation had been most complete, received juvenile sentencing that included community service and mandatory counseling, allowing him to eventually complete his education through alternative programs. Marcus and Danny, whose resistance to accountability had continued throughout the legal process, faced adult charges that effectively ended their educational and athletic aspirations. But perhaps the most significant transformation was in the culture at Riverside High itself. The systematic intimidation that had characterized the school's social environment for years was replaced by genuine respect for academic achievement and personal character. Students learned that true power came from competence and integrity, rather than family connections or athletic ability. Sarah continued teaching literature with the same gentle approach that had characterized her methods before the confrontation, but now her students understood that her kindness reflected choice rather than weakness. Her classroom became a sanctuary where learning flourished because respect was mutual and authentic, and where students learned that real strength meant protecting others rather than exploiting vulnerabilities. The quiet teacher who had seemed so helpless to 3 entitled bullies had proven that appearances could be deceiving, that preparation could overcome privilege, and that sometimes the most important lessons were taught outside the curriculum. Her students learned that heroism often looked like ordinary people making extraordinary choices when faced with injustice, and that the greatest victories were those that protected others from facing similar battles alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. The coordination of their positioning, the increasingly personal nature of their comments, and the careful timing of this after-hours encounter all suggested young men who'd planned this interaction with specific objectives in mind. I appreciate your perspective, Sarah said quietly, her voice maintaining its characteristic gentleness, while her body prepared for action in ways her students had never witnessed. However, I maintain consistent academic standards for all students, because fairness and integrity are fundamental to effective education. If you're concerned about specific assignments or grades, I'm happy to schedule proper conferences during regular office hours. Marcus straightened slightly, his expression shifting from confident intimidation to genuine irritation at Sarah's refusal to display the fear response he'd expected. In his experience, isolated teachers confronted by 3 large male students typically became flustered, apologetic, or openly frightened. Sarah's calm professionalism represented an unexpected deviation from the script he'd followed successfully with other faculty members. "See, that's exactly the attitude that's going to cause you problems," Marcus said, his voice hardening as he realized that subtle intimidation wasn't producing the desired effect. "You're new enough at Riverside that you don't understand how things really work around here. Some teachers learn to be flexible, and they have successful careers. Others insist on being difficult, and they find themselves facing all kinds of unexpected challenges." Danny moved closer to Sarah's desk, his approach angled to create additional psychological pressure while maintaining the facade of casual conversation. Challenges like having their car vandalized in the parking lot, or finding out that parents have been calling the administration with complaints about their teaching methods. Funny how those things seem to happen to teachers who don't understand the importance of school spirit and athletic support. The threat was clear enough that even the most naive faculty member would understand the implications, but Sarah's expression remained unchanged as she processed the information. These three had clearly developed a systematic approach to intimidating teachers into grade modification and special treatment, using a combination of psychological pressure, implied threats, and the kind of consequences that would be difficult to trace back to their actions. Kyle's voice carried from the doorway with the casual menace of someone comfortable with causing fear. Course, some teachers are smarter than others. Take Mrs. Patterson in chemistry. She used to be real strict about attendance and lab reports. But now she understands that flexibility is important. Amazing how much less stressful her job became once she figured out the system. Sarah recognized the name and understood immediately that Mrs. Patterson's recent changes in grading policies in classroom management hadn't been voluntary professional development, but the result of successful intimidation by this same group. The pattern suggested they'd perfected their approach through multiple successful campaigns against faculty members who lacked the resources or support to resist effectively. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Sarah asked, her tone remaining professionally neutral, while her awareness expanded to catalog every potential weapon within reach, every possible avenue of movement, and every tactical advantage or disadvantage presented by the classroom's layout and furniture arrangement. Marcus's smile widened as he interpreted her question as evidence of weakening resolve rather than tactical assessment. "We're suggesting that smart teachers find ways to show appreciation for the students who bring honor to Riverside High. Maybe some extra credit opportunities for athletes who miss class due to competition travel. Maybe some flexibility on due dates when training schedules conflict with assignment deadlines. Just common-sense accommodations that recognize reality." Danny nodded enthusiastically, moving close enough to Sarah's desk that his presence became actively threatening rather than merely intimidating. "Exactly. And teachers who show that kind of school spirit tend to find that their jobs become much easier. Better student evaluations, fewer parent complaints, more support from administration. It's really a win-win situation when everyone understands their role." The conversation had reached the critical point that Sarah's training had taught her to recognize: the moment when psychological intimidation either succeeded in producing submission or escalated to physical confrontation. She could see in Marcus's eyes that he was preparing to increase the pressure, and the positioning of his companions suggested they were ready to support whatever action he chose to take. "I understand your position," Sarah said quietly, rising slowly from her chair with movements that appeared casual but actually optimized her tactical positioning for whatever was about to occur. "However, I maintain consistent academic standards for all students, regardless of their extracurricular activities or family connections." Marcus's face flushed with anger at her continued resistance, and Sarah saw the exact moment when his control snapped. His hand shot forward with the aggressive speed of someone accustomed to getting physical when intimidation failed, grabbing the front of her conservative white blouse with the clear intention of jerking her forward across the desk. The fabric tore with a sharp ripping sound that seemed to echo through the quiet classroom as Marcus yanked hard enough to pop several buttons and expose Sarah's shoulder. His intention was clearly to humiliate and frighten her into submission through a display of physical dominance that would leave her feeling violated and powerless. But as the torn fabric fell away from Sarah's shoulder, it revealed something that made all three young men freeze in sudden uncertainty. Instead of the soft, unmarked skin they'd expected to see, Sarah's exposed shoulder and upper arm showed the kind of defined musculature that only came from years of intensive physical training. More telling were the thin, precise scars that marked her skin, the kind of marks left by competition injuries in contact sports that most teachers had never experienced. Marcus still held the torn fabric in his fist, but his expression had shifted from aggressive confidence to confusion as he processed the unexpected revelation. Danny and Kyle had both noticed the change in atmosphere, though they weren't yet certain what had caused their leader's sudden hesitation. Sarah looked down at her ruined blouse with the kind of calm assessment that suggested she was evaluating damage to equipment, rather than experiencing violation or fear. When she raised her eyes to meet Marcus's gaze, there was something in her expression that made him involuntarily take a step backward despite his size advantage and the support of his companions. "That," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a new undertone that none of her students had ever heard before, "was a mistake." The torn fabric hung from Marcus's fist like evidence of a crime he was only beginning to understand he'd committed. The 3 football players stood frozen in a tableau that had shifted from predatory confidence to sudden uncertainty, though none of them could yet articulate exactly what had changed in the small classroom's atmosphere. Sarah reached for the cardigan draped over her chair back, pulling it on with the same methodical precision she applied to organizing lesson plans. Sarah had observed their behavior throughout the school year, noting how other students moved differently when they appeared, how conversations quieted in their presence, and how even veteran teachers modified their classroom management when these 3 were present. Sarah continued grading papers while the voices outside grew louder and more animated, discussing weekend plans that involved parties at houses where parents would be conveniently absent and activities that skirted the edges of legality. She could hear them clearly through the thin classroom door, their conversation peppered with casual cruelty toward students they considered beneath, their social status and dismissive comments about teachers they'd successfully intimidated into submission. The conversation turned to specific faculty members, and Sarah heard her own name mentioned with the kind of casual disrespect that suggested she'd become a topic of discussion among this group. Marcus's voice carried clearly as he described her as the pushover English teacher who never fights back about anything, and speculated about how far they could push her before she'd finally react. Danny's contribution involved crude comments about her appearance and suggestions about what they could get away with given her apparent passivity and the isolation of her classroom location. Sarah felt the familiar calm settling over her mind as her trained instincts began assessing the developing threat. Years of competitive martial arts had taught her to recognize the escalating energy patterns that preceded violence, and everything about this conversation suggested young men working themselves up to action rather than simply venting frustration. The location was isolated, the timing ensured minimal witnesses, and their tone indicated they'd moved beyond theoretical discussion toward actual planning. The classroom door handle turned slowly, and Sarah looked up from her papers with an expression of mild curiosity that concealed the heightened alertness flooding her nervous system. Marcus entered first, his 6-foot frame filling the doorway. As he surveyed the empty classroom with obvious satisfaction, his Letterman jacket stretched across shoulders broadened by years of elite athletic training, and his movements carried the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to physical dominance. In most situations, Danny followed, his stockier build and aggressive posture creating an immediate sense of threat as he positioned himself near the windows, effectively blocking one potential exit route. His eyes swept the classroom with predatory assessment, noting the isolation, the closed door, and Sarah's small frame behind the teacher's desk. Kyle entered last, his massive presence seeming to shrink the classroom as he positioned himself near the door. His 6'4" frame and 250-pound bulk creating an imposing barrier. Sarah set down her pen and looked up at the 3 students with the kind of polite attention she'd give to any after-hours visitor, though her peripheral vision was already cataloging escape routes, potential weapons, and the precise distances between herself and each of the intruders. Her voice carried its usual gentle tone as she addressed them, showing no trace of the tactical assessment occurring beneath her calm exterior. "Can I help you with something? Office hours don't officially start until tomorrow, but if you need to discuss makeup work or upcoming assignments, I'm happy to answer questions." Marcus's smile held no warmth as he approached her desk with deliberate slowness, his body language designed to intimidate through proximity and size advantage. "Actually, Ms. Chen, we wanted to talk to you about something more personal. See, we've been having some discussions about teachers who don't really understand how things work around here, and your name keeps coming up." Danny moved closer to the windows, his presence eliminating Sarah's access to that side of the room while maintaining the casual posture of someone simply wandering around the classroom. "Yeah, we've noticed you don't really participate in school spirit activities. No football games, no pep rallies, no team support functions. Makes us wonder if you really care about Riverside High or if you're just collecting a paycheck." Kyle remained by the door, his massive frame creating a psychological barrier even as he maintained the pretense of casual conversation. "Some teachers understand that certain students deserve special consideration because of what we bring to the school. Championships, college recruitment, community pride. But you seem to think everyone should be treated exactly the same, which shows you don't really get the bigger picture." Sarah maintained her composed expression while her trained mind processed the coordination of their positioning, the escalating nature of their language, and the increasingly obvious intent behind this after-hours visit. They'd chosen this time and location deliberately, understanding that their actions would occur without witnesses or immediate administrative intervention. Their positioning suggested experience with intimidation tactics, and their confidence indicated they'd successfully used similar approaches with other faculty members. "I treat all students fairly according to school policy and academic standards," Sarah replied evenly, her hands remaining visible on the desk while her weight shifted almost imperceptibly into a more balanced position. "If you have specific concerns about grades or assignments, I'm happy to review them according to established procedures." Marcus's laugh carried genuine menace as he leaned forward, placing both hands on her desk in a gesture designed to invade her personal space and establish physical dominance. "See, that's exactly the attitude we're talking about. You hide behind policies and procedures instead of understanding that some situations require more flexible thinking. We're trying to help you understand how things really work around here before you make any mistakes that might affect your future at Riverside." Sarah remained perfectly still as Marcus leaned across her desk, his proximity intended to trigger the fear response that had proven effective with other faculty members who'd found themselves in similar situations. His cologne was expensive, but applied heavily, the scent mixing with the underlying smell of protein supplements, and the particular combination of privilege and aggression that seemed to emanate from young men who'd never learned the difference between confidence and intimidation. "You know what your problem is, Miss Chen," Marcus continued, his voice dropping to what he probably imagined was a threatening whisper. "You don't understand that teaching isn't just about books and assignments. It's about relationships, about understanding which students matter to the success of this school and which ones are just taking up space." Danny had positioned himself directly between Sarah and the windows, his casual examination of student artwork on the walls serving as cover for cutting off potential escape routes. His movements carried the practiced efficiency of someone who'd participated in similar intimidation sessions, and his occasional glances toward Kyle suggested a level of coordination that spoke to previous experience with cornering isolated teachers. "We've been watching how you interact with different students," Danny added, his tone carrying false reasonableness that barely concealed the underlying menace. "Some teachers understand that star athletes need special consideration because of the pressure we're under, the time commitments, the importance of maintaining our eligibility for college recruitment. but you seem to think everyone deserves exactly the same treatment, which shows you don't really understand your role here. Kyle's contribution came in the form of a low chuckle that rumbled through his massive chest as he shifted his weight against the doorframe. The movement was subtle but effective, emphasizing his size while simultaneously blocking the most obvious exit route. His presence alone was intimidating enough that most people would feel trapped, and his reputation for violence added an undercurrent of genuine danger to the situation. Sarah's training had taught her to recognize the escalation patterns that preceded actual violence, and every signal she was receiving indicated that this encounter was building toward physical confrontation rather than simply remaining at the level of verbal intimidation.